At the moment, the locals are quoting anything from 200 to possibly 100 injured people. These are all gunshot wounds. And as you can see behind me, we've got all the bays are full and they're all gunshot wounds. It's absolute carnage here.
What you're hearing is the sound of a British doctor, Victoria Rose, who is working at the Nasser Hospital in the Gaza Strip. She's reacting to an incident that has been described by Doctors Without Borders as a massacre. At the time of recording, at least 30 people are dead after Israeli forces opened fire on people trying to get food from an aid distribution center in southern Gaza on Sunday. It's part of a new Israeli-backed food program run by U.S. security contractors. Other videos from last week show hundreds of people contained in this fencing, with bowls in their hands, arms extended, waiting to be poured food. Since the early days of the war, Israel's restriction of food in Gaza has been the subject of international condemnation. Israeli settlers have blocked roads and aid convoys carrying food to refugee camps. Aid distribution and workers have also been targeted with violence. In March, Israel blocked all aid into Gaza. Today, a trickle is allowed to get inside the territory. International organizations have been warning of man-made famine in the Gaza Strip for more than a year now. Alex Duvall is the executive director of the World Peace Foundation at Tufts University, and he is the author of books like Mass Starvation, The History and Future of Famine. He is one of the world's authorities on the issue of famine and wartime starvation crimes, and he joins me today to talk about the issue of man-made hunger, what that looks like in Gaza through history, and what happens when people turn food into a weapon of war. Alex, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's great to be with you.
So nearly a decade ago now, you began to believe that we had moved beyond this question of famine and large-scale starvation crimes. You wrote this piece in the New York Times titled, "Is the Era of Great Famines Over?" And just before we get deeper into this episode, I wanted to know where that optimism or belief in what the future was to hold came from.
So I started working on the issue of famine as a scholar and a humanitarian practitioner back in the 1980s. And I was monitoring and being very closely engaged with the numbers of famines that were happening worldwide. And in the first decade of this century, after about 2000 or so, the number and the lethality of the famines that we had been seeing dwindled almost to zero. There were just a handful of outstanding cases. And it looked as though we were on track to eliminate famine completely from the world. And I was hopeful that this could be done in the coming few years. And the main reason why this could be done was that famine as a weapon of war was becoming less and less used and more stringently outlawed by international practice and international law. And so by 2016, actually, when I began to write my book, Mass Starvation, it was going to be called The History of Famine. And then as I was writing it, famine made a comeback, and I had to add in some less pessimistic projections into the future.
When you say famine made a comeback, can you just tell me what you're referring to there? What are you thinking about there?
So during the year 2016, the UN began to warn of likely famines in several locations around the world. In northern Nigeria, where there was a vicious war going on between the jihadist group Boko Haram and the Nigerian government.
Intense fighting against the Boko Haram insurgency has prevented farmers from growing and harvesting crops, sometimes for years in a row. It's also made it difficult for humanitarian convoys carrying food and medicine to reach isolated communities.
In South Sudan, which was in the depths of civil war,
for months, all we have been eating are leaves and palm fruits. Over half the population here is at risk of starvation. Such alarming levels of hunger are new to northern Bahr al-Ghazal, a relatively stable region of South Sudan.
In Somalia, where there was a collapsed state and there was a very severe drought.
The drought compounds an already challenging humanitarian situation in the area and has brought the estimated number of people who face acute food security crisis and emergency in Somaliland and Puntland to 385,000. Another 1.3 million people are at risk of slipping into acute food insecurity if they do.
And in Yemen, where a coalition led by Saudi Arabia was waging a war of hunger against the Houthi rebels in that country, but causing famine much more widely than just the targeted Houthis.
In the villages of Yemen, it's the children who suffer most. Wherever you go, you can see the human cost of this war.
I think it might be helpful for us just to make clear, or for me to ask you, exactly what famine is. How is it measured? And if you could provide some insight into what is meant by the word famine, how famine determinations are met, what threshold has to be met in order to declare a hunger crisis or a famine.
So famine is basically mass starvation, an episode of extreme hunger where people are deprived of food. There may be food around, but people are prevented from getting it, or it's too expensive for them to buy in the market. And very often what we've seen in situations of historic famine is you then get epidemics of infectious disease on top of that, which are actually the major killers. Now, when I started my career in famine, there was no established mechanism, or there was no threshold agreed for what was and what wasn't a famine. It was really who cried loudest, or where the worst pictures of starving children could be located. But in the early 2000s, a group of nutritionists and food security experts got together and said, we need to be able to target food much more effectively on an objective basis. And they established something called the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification System, which is a real mouthful. It's called the IPC for short. And what they do is they integrate information about how hungry people are, where they're getting their food from or not getting their food from, rates of malnutrition among children, and whether there's been an increase in the death rate. And then they put this on a scale. And the worst point on the scale, phase 5, they call famine, when 20% of a population in a given area has complete lack of food, high rates of malnutrition, and elevated mortality. So that was agreed by a consensus of experts, but it has no standing in law. It's just a tool of convenience for the purposes of humanitarian aid donors and the like to ascertain how bad things are in particular places.
Has anybody placed Gaza on that scale at the moment?
So beginning a few weeks after the October the 7th Hamas terrorist attacks and the Israeli response, this IPC system kicked in, and they've made now 5 different assessments of the situation in Gaza. And each time what they found is very, very widespread levels of extreme food insecurity, high levels of hunger, high levels of malnutrition. They've not classified it as famine. And it seems to be that it's just teetering on the edge of what they would call famine. But it may also be, as some Palestinians from Gaza say, that they're just not able to get the data, that the information, particularly about mortality among children, simply hasn't been collected. And therefore, because of that particular technical reason, Gaza hasn't crossed the threshold as they measure it.
When people hear the word famine, they might think of like a natural disaster, something like a drought, maybe. But you have written, quote, Almost all famines are principally caused by war and political repression carried out with disregard for human life. And what do you think is missed when famine and starvation are presented as crimes of nature rather than crimes of man?
So, historically, of course, if we go back hundreds of years, when the annual harvest was the heartbeat of the economy, and if an agrarian society like the first settlers in New England missed two harvests in a row, yes, they would go hungry. Yes, they might starve. And back in the 70s and 80s, there were serious hunger crises caused by drought. And for charities, it was always much more convenient if they're raising money to point to the weather as the culprit. It made a simpler story. It was easier for people to give. But the sad reality has been that for 150 years, if not longer, most famines are caused by a government policy, particularly communist governments were notorious for this, or by war, by colonialism, by world wars, by the deliberate use of starvation as a weapon. And it's only, I think, fairly recently that truth has begun to sink in. And if we continue to see famines as primarily a natural disaster, we simply treat them as anomalies needing charity, not scandals needing political action.
You have written really powerfully about what starvation and hunger can do to a person, how it subjects a person to a kind of humiliation and shame, how it turns the body against itself, how it forces people to make impossible decisions like which child to feed today, how victims and survivors are often looked at as second class victims. You've talked about this sense of shame everywhere from Ireland to South Sudan, where many victims of hunger are not actually buried. And just could you tell me more about what it does to its victims and how it can live with a group of people for many generations?
So, in a very biological sense, if a healthy adult, is deprived of food completely within 60 to 80 days, that person will waste away, and the body will consume itself, starting with the reserves of fat, and then the vital organs, and the brain functions will shut down, and people actually go crazy. There's a sort of starvation madness that can take over people, and with children, it's that much quicker. Of course, what we usually see is not total starvation like that. We see a more protracted version extending over months and made worse often by infectious disease and dehydration and lack of shelter. But this social aspect, this sort of societal torture, is perhaps what is most underappreciated. Because as you mentioned, in order for people to feed themselves and their families, they break social taboos. They scavenge in garbage. They eat things that they shouldn't. They're not allowed to eat. They deny the basic courtesy, reciprocity, generosity to relatives. They turn away starving children from the door. They turn a blind eye to food theft, to people, young women and girls selling their bodies for sex. And these traumas, these humiliations last for generations, so that after the Great Hunger in Ireland in the 1840s, it was more than 100 years before public commemoration of that famine was possible in Ireland. People only spoke about it in whispers, silently, very quietly at home, and refused, didn't want to face what starvation had done to them and to their society.
I wonder if now we could spend some more time talking about Gaza specifically. The images coming out of Gaza right now are horrifying. videos, as I mentioned in the intro, of hundreds of Palestinians with these silver bowls in their hands, clawing and reaching through fencing. Thousands of people descending upon UN facilities stocked full of unused aid. People kind of climbing over one another, screaming, fighting over sacks of flour. They're really scenes of complete desperation. And just what is your reaction to the current state of food availability in Gaza, and who is responsible for it?
So Gaza is a very unique situation. It's a situation in which one a belligerent power, in this case Israel, has complete control over the amount of food that goes into the Gaza Strip, into the territory. It also has complete control over water, over fuel, over healthcare, etc. And it immediately after October 7th, it put a complete blockade. And then it began occasionally relaxing that blockade, allowing sufficient food in. On the grounds that Hamas is consuming the food and Hamas is actually preventing food from getting to the civilian population, an allegation that is not supported by any evidence that has been presented to the United Nations or indeed to the US government, but is nonetheless made.
Have you seen evidence that it is Hamas stealing the food?
No, not at all. Not in this round. Listen, these people are desperate, and they see a World Food Program truck coming in, and they run for it. This doesn't have anything to do with Hamas or any kind of organized crime or anything. It has simply to do with the fact these people are starving to death.
Israel has insisted that it take control of food distribution entirely into its own hands. It doesn't want the UN, which it sees as not neutral, as not partisan. The UN strongly refutes this, but Israel insists it wants complete control of this mechanism. It has put it in the hands of a new mechanism called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is run on the ground by private military contractors, protected by Israeli troops. And this is a form of control of food rations, of a degree of intensity, of granularity that I don't think we've ever seen before. Perhaps the only example would be something like the British Operation Starvation in Malaysia. And the stated public logic for Israel is, first of all, it will deny food to Hamas, but also that it will provide enough food for Gaza to stop descending into famine.
From day one, or the early days of the war, we decided on a policy. We are going after Hamas. We're not going after the civilian population, both in allowing it to leave the theaters of combat, but also by supplying them with essential requirements: food, water, medicine. That's what international law and common sense requires. So we did.
Now, humanitarian aid professionals concur that, let's put aside the ethics and the legality of this, but they concur that it won't work. And it won't work for a couple of reasons. First of all, there just isn't enough. There isn't enough food going in to feed everybody. And the people of Gaza have been subjected to so much deprivation, so much hunger, that the margin, the amount of food stores left, any scraps that might be available, have basically disappeared. So people are now entirely dependent on what comes in, and what's coming in, even under the best case with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, isn't enough.
Now, the UN's World Food Programme says that hordes of hungry people have broken into a food supply warehouse in central Gaza. Videos show chaotic scenes of people taking the supplies as shots were fired. The WFP says at least 4 people died in the incident and several were injured. It comes a day after a depot in Rafah, run by the controversial US-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, was overrun by Palestinians desperate for food.
Secondly, it's not targeting those who really need it. So it's not enough just to put in food. You also need specialized foodstuffs and specialized care for those most malnourished children. They can't just eat, regular pasta or canned tuna. They need specialized care, and the humanitarian agencies provide it. These private military contractors can't provide that. They also can't provide the clean water, the basic sanitation, the essential health care. But the other thing that's happening here is that the previous aid system, which was well established, run by the UN and by well established local Palestinian agencies like the Red Crescent and international ones, had more than 400 distribution sites and was deeply embedded within the Palestinian society. So people knew what to expect. There was a social infrastructure for them having confidence in how this aid would work. Israel does not want to use that. It wants to entirely bypass that and provide individualized rations based upon individualized screening. And what this means is that the ordinary people of Gaza, who are desperately hungry, simply have no confidence in this system. There's no way of them being assured that their regular sort of aid distribution is going to be there. And so, of course, they crowd around. They are desperate. All they know is that there are some supplies there in the hands of unfamiliar people, and they want to get it. And of course, then law and order breaks down.
They said they would send aid to us. We went to receive the aid, and we were surprised by the Israeli army killing us after bringing us to, as it were, a safe place.
This is surveillance footage of the aid centre itself, apparently at dawn this morning. It shows Palestinians running across the sand to collect food. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is backed by America and Israel, says it's peaceful and that reports of dead and injured are fabricated by Hamas.
And whether deliberately or because you have overwhelmed and panicked and underprepared military contractors or troops on the ground who don't know what to do, you have these terrible crimes and tragedies of people getting shot.
I should just ask you the question I think many people probably have right now listening to you. Do you believe Israel to be using food as a weapon of war? Are these war crimes?
Israel is using food and using hunger, surpassing what it is legitimately allowed to do so in pursuit of its political and military objectives. I do believe Israel is breaking international law in the way that it's using food.
Another facet of this is what appears to be Israel's targeting of aid workers. So earlier this year, the head of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs wrote that statements by Israeli authorities vilify our aid workers even as the military attacks them. Community volunteers who accompany our convoys are being targeted. Israel has also led a campaign against UNRWA, the organization most commonly associated with administering food to the region.
UNRWA employs over 1,200 Hamas members, including terrorists who carried out the October 7th massacre. This isn't aid, it's direct financial support for terror.
Last year, vehicles carrying staff of the NGO World Central Kitchen were fired on, killing 7 aid workers.
In the words of the World Central Kitchen, this was a targeted attack. A direct hit on the group's armored vehicle, incinerating everything and everyone inside.
The UN says more than 330 aid workers have been killed in Gaza since the war began. Meanwhile,
NGOs and aid workers abide by comprehensive systems. When working in conflict zone systems, they rely on all over the world for safety. But these systems don't appear to be or hadn't been holding up. And what role do you think violence plays in the broader effort to feed a starving population?
So Israel will argue that humanitarian aid workers often fall as casualties in conflicts.
Unfortunately, in the last day, there was a tragic incident of an unintended strike of our forces on innocent people in the Gaza Strip. This happens in war. We are checking this thoroughly. We are in touch with the government, and we will do everything for this not to happen again.
As you say, there are established protocols for deconfliction, for communication, etc., between those aid agencies and the controlling militaries to try and minimize that. And Israel has a very sophisticated communications and command and control system. What's very shocking is that in the numbers of aid workers killed in the line of duty around the world, which has always been too high. In the last 18 months, well over half the entire number worldwide have been killed just in this one conflict, Gaza. Far more have been killed there than in the next worst countries like Sudan or South Sudan or Congo. Far more than in Syria in the worst of those days. And the argument that they are collateral damage, that these are errors, simply doesn't hold up when this is happening so persistently. And when on each occasion, or almost every occasion in which there is an investigation, it turns out that the agency in question was following the correct protocols. Or in the case of the Palestinian Red Crescent aid workers who were killed, it turns out actually they were killed in cold blood. That was a case earlier this year. The credibility of Israel's claims that these are unfortunate accidents, or that these agencies are working with Hamas, they really don't stand up to scrutiny.
I'd like to ask you about what you think the American role is here. Your writing features anecdotes of U.S. officials working essentially to obscure or ignore events on the ground. You write, for example, that senators like Bernie Sanders and Chris Van Hollen threatened to prohibit U.S. assistance to Israel, but were ultimately undercut by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, that there was this report on starvation in Gaza that was made public, then quickly deleted by USAID, as well as other instances in which American officials publicly contradicted internal reports on hunger in Gaza. How would you characterize America's role in this?
So under the Biden administration, America was very clearly on Israel's side, very hostile to Hamas, and was giving Israel a great deal of latitude in pursuing its war aims, using pretty much all means necessary. But the Biden administration was also very keen for the humanitarian situation in Gaza not to cross that threshold into famine. So on several occasions, when its own senior aid officials or the UN's IPC warned that threshold was being crossed or was at risk of being crossed, the US put a lot of pressure on Israel to allow in aid to lessen up the pressure. It's very hard to know what the strategy and position has been of the Trump administration since it took office. In the first weeks, clearly there was a ceasefire and a lot of humanitarian aid was going in. And more recently, since the ceasefire broke down, since the fighting resumed, since the blockade was put back in place, we've seen some statements, but it is not entirely clear whether the Trump administration has a policy of preventing Gaza starving in famine or not. That remains entirely opaque.
Another way that we've seen countries defer the responsibility to deliver aid is through designations of terrorism. You've written about this in Ethiopia, where the government designated the most widely followed political party in Tigray, a terrorist organization. You've also written about this in Somalia, where the U.S. government's designation of al-Shabaab as a terror group challenged aid organizations working to provide food to the hungry. Much of the same is now true in Gaza with the terror designation of Hamas. And what role do you think these designations can have when talking about weaponizing food?
Governments over the years have always wanted to delegitimize insurgents by calling them bandits or terrorists, and thereby to prohibit and criminalize providing them with assistance. And the US Patriot Act, passed shortly after 9/11, was a very powerful and actually very blunt tool that prevented, criminalized actually any individual or agency, whether US or other, that provided any assistance, material or otherwise, willing or unwitting, to a terrorist designated group. And that tool was used to cast a real sort of chill over aid operations, notably in Somalia in 2011, preventing them from providing aid out of the fear, the suspicion that some of it might be taken by the terrorist group al-Shabaab. And that contributed to a famine that was foreseen, that was well monitored and was unfolding. But aid agencies didn't dare cross that line until a famine had been declared, when the Obama administration made what it called the humanitarian workaround, saying, let's provide aid where there is a designated famine, even if some of this aid may fall into terrorist hands. We will obviously try and monitor it as scrupulously as we can. And since that time, one of the fallouts of this has been that the UN and other international agencies are extremely scrupulous and careful in monitoring aid. And of course, that doesn't prevent all leakage. It doesn't prevent some manipulation, some theft. But the monitoring systems are by and large pretty good. And most of the aid professionals that I've spoken to think that they have stood up really well in Gaza, actually, that only very modest amounts of food aid going into, and other assistance going into Gaza, have been stolen or hoarded or sold by Hamas. Some of them say that one of the impacts of the restrictions imposed by Israel is that these monitoring systems actually can't function as well as they should be. So Israeli restrictions actually are allowing more food to be looted, not particularly by Hamas, but mostly by the armed gangs that are now roaming and terrorizing the people there.
Mm-hmm. When you were writing about northern Ethiopia's Tigray region, you said, quote, "I have never witnessed in my professional career, in my historical research, such systematic, such ruthless, such cruel starvation, crimes perpetrated as those inflicted on the people of Tigray." But despite this, Ethiopia's prime minister has said that there has not been a single death due to starvation in Tigray. The country went so far as to host the UN-sponsored World Without Hunger conference last year. Israeli officials have produced similar denials of famine and widespread starvation. The museum dedicated to the siege of Leningrad was closed after the conclusion of the Second World War in a bid to suppress the story of what happened. Similar denials were made during the siege of Srebrenica as well. And what role do you think denialism generally plays during moments like this?
I think denialism is absolutely key. And it was Stalin who, during the genocidal famine he inflicted on the Ukrainians in the 1930s, the Holodomor, said that infamous line, when one man dies of hunger, it's a tragedy. 1 million deaths are a statistic. And consistently, those who are responsible for starvation, they know how emotive, how shocking, how the knowledge about mass starvation is, and especially how pictures of starving children move people to act. And so they always try and cover it up and deny it and play it down.
The second one is that we have a policy of starvation. Did you hear that? You didn't? That's the current fad, the current lie.
And it's absolutely critical that that journalists and others who document what is going on, who collect the data, are allowed to do their job.
I know you might have already answered parts of this, but I think it would be helpful for me to kind of ask this one to you straight. Some have compared Israel's siege on food in Gaza to the Allies' blockade on food in Nazi Germany, a systematic effort aimed at pushing the German public away from their Nazi leaders. You've written about starvation crimes in the U.S. Civil War and the fact that the U.S. blockade on Japan in 1945 was literally codenamed Operation Starvation. The fact that hunger has really always been a tool used by governments and militaries looking to control unruly or even insurrectionist populations. What is it about starving a perceived enemy or conditioning access to food on surrender that has made it a feature of war and conflict for so much of our history?
Starvation is a very cheap way of inflicting misery and of achieving war goals, such as weakening the enemy to the point of surrender. It's been the favored tool of Britain and the United States, and it's especially favored when its impacts can be covered up, can be concealed. After World War II, there were some who thought that there would be, as part of the Geneva Conventions, as part of the raft of new international law associated with the UN, there were some who thought starvation as a war crime would be prohibited. But the British in particular were very keen to continue to be able to use hunger as a weapon. And indeed, in Malaysia in the 1950s, they went so far as to call their counterinsurgency operations Operation Starvation. And it wasn't until the 1970s that international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, were revised to begin to outlaw it. And I think by the early 2000s, there was really an international consensus that this was unacceptable. And part of the reason for that was that international humanitarian organizations, especially the UN, the World Food Programme, and others, were able to provide humanitarian aid in war zones in such a way that it was sufficiently monitored, sufficiently neutral and impartial, that it didn't end up supporting war efforts. It was feeding civilians, but not becoming part of the overall war economy.
Just on international law, you have written that the crime of starvation has not yet been tested in a court, so there is no case law. And you've also referred to it as a stagnant backwater of international criminal law. I think people listening might wonder, how can that be? How is it that killing a single person is considered a crime, but that the killing of many via intentional starvation is somehow difficult to prosecute?
It's an appalling historical reality that starvation was permitted in law from the Lieber Code, which was the code Abraham Lincoln had drawn up for the American Civil War, and permitted starvation. The prosecutors at Nuremberg after World War II tried to prosecute a German commander for the siege of Leningrad, but the judges said, regrettably, it was not unlawful, and he was acquitted of that charge.
Huh.
And because it hasn't been on the law books, there haven't been prosecutions. And it wasn't even outlawed in civil wars, in non-international armed conflicts, until 2019, which meant that the international criminal tribunals for former Yugoslavia, for Rwanda, the International Criminal Court, looking at Darfur, for example, were not able to prosecute for starvation. And the charges that the prosecutor of the ICC has brought against Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, and his former defense minister, Yoav Gallant, for the war crime of starvation, are the first time this has actually happened in an international court.
Alex Duval, I want to thank you very much for this.
You are very welcome.
Okay, that is all for today. I'm Jamie Poisson. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you tomorrow.